One summer afternoon in 2016, a young woman squeezed into the tiny bathroom on board a fishing vessel. She locked the door behind her and leaned in close to the mirror to get a good look at her face, in particular her left eye, which was disturbingly red. She used both hands to stretch the skin back around her eye, and the tissue along the edge of her eyelid looked totally strange. So she just ran a finger along it, and then suddenly something dislodged from her eye. It was the small sliver of fuzz, about the size and thickness of a carpet fiber. The woman leaned in closer to the mirror and delicately pinched this weird strand and pulled it away from her eye. She held it up to the bathroom light, trying to figure out what it was, and to her surprise, it was almost half an inch long. As she stood there wondering how on earth this weird piece of fiber had gotten wedged in her eye, something strange happened. The little strand began to move. This episode is called It Moves. 26-year-old Abby Beckley perched high in her saddle and spurred her horse into a gallop. She savored the feeling of the wind on her cheeks as she galloped across the pasture towards the stable. Abby had spent the first half of the summer of 2016 renting a room at a converted cattle ranch in Gold Beach, Oregon. She spent her days riding horses and exploring the coast. It was only a half-hour north from where she grew up, so it was a familiar landscape. But being out in nature never got old to Abby. She tried to spend the majority of every summer outside soaking up the sunshine. This August afternoon was her last day at the cattle ranch. She was ready for a new adventure, and tomorrow she was traveling to Alaska to work as a deckhand on a commercial salmon fishing boat. She'd never been out to sea longer than a few days, but Abby was always game to expand her horizons and try new things. Abby pulled on the reins for the horse to stop, then she dismounted and walked the horse into the stable. Once it was in its stall, Abby latched the gate and then walked down the row of other stalls, saying her goodbyes to the other horses. At the end of the aisle was the ranch's one remaining cow, munching hay all alone. Abby gave the cow a little rub on her nose, then she closed the stable door and headed off for her next adventure in Alaska. The next day, Abby took 2 planes and a taxi before arriving in the small town of Craig, Alaska, where her boat was docked. As she walked down the street, she could tell she'd entered a whole new world. The woods on the mountainside were thick and unbroken. The peaks rising above her were snow-capped, even in summer, and the air was crisp in a way she'd never felt before. Abby headed down to the waterfront and saw her boat docked in the harbor. Her first thought was that it looked smaller than it did in the pictures she'd seen. But the crew members who greeted her were warm and welcoming, and one of them led Abby to her bunk and helped her get settled. She was happy to be there and excited for what lay ahead. The next morning, the whole crew had arrived, and once supplies were loaded, the fishing vessel pulled away from shore and headed across the bay towards the open ocean. Right away, it was time for Abby to get to work. She was paired with another young woman named Allison, who was a regular crew member who showed Abby how to work with the other deckhands to cast out the big weighted nets called seines. It was a tricky process. Abby had to help fling the enormous net into the waves with one hand while gripping a rope to drag it back in with the other hand. Also, the net tangled very easily and was surprisingly heavy once it got wet. Abby's first morning was exhausting. Waves kept splashing up on the deck, soaking her and making her shake with cold. Even though it was summer, the wind that whipped across the water had a bite to it. Over the next few days, Abby's mentor, Allison, taught her everything she could about working on a commercial fishing boat. Allison showed Abby how to sort the fish by weight, how to stack them neatly in coolers of ice for sale back on the mainland, how to swab the deck, how to clean the knives and hooks and nets, which were always getting soaked in fish blood and bait. And so Abby came to learn that life at sea was both messy and dangerous. But it was worth it. On Abby's first Friday night on the boat, the crew grilled a festive dinner on the deck and watched the sunset together. At that moment, Abby realized that there was nowhere else in the world she'd rather be. This was awesome. After dinner, Abby helped clean up in the kitchen, and then she flopped down on her bunk. Abby listened to the sound of the waves outside and started to nod off, but she was distracted by an odd itch in her left eye. She wondered if it was a grain of sand or maybe a fragment of barnacle from the nets. So she rolled out of bed, went down the hall to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on her face. Abby tried to blink to kind of clean her left eye. Then she patted her face dry and went back to her bunk. She needed to get some sleep. Tomorrow was going to be another very long day of work. The next morning, Abby's left eye was still bothering her, only now she had a headache too. She went back to the bathroom and looked at her eye again, and now she could see it was red and inflamed. Abby decided she would just ignore it for now and get on with her chores. There were fish to be caught. 5 days later, Abby stood on the deck trying to work through her discomfort. She still wasn't feeling any better. Her headaches had grown from mild to full-blown migraines, and even worse, her left eyelid was now starting to droop, which made it hard for her to open her eye all the way. At breakfast that morning, Abby's mentor, Allison, asked her if she was okay, and Abby said that she was uncomfortable, but what was going on with her was probably just a stubborn case of pink eye. Fortunately, their boat was scheduled to return to the town of Craig that afternoon for a short stay to offload fish, restock supplies, and give the crew some time off. Abby decided that it was time to face the facts here, that whatever was going on with her eye and her headache was likely not going to go away on its own. She needed medical intervention. So once the boat pulled into the harbor, Abby helped tie it to the pier. Most of the crew went into town to buy supplies, do laundry, and enjoy a day on land, but Abby went back onto the boat and down the hall to the bathroom. Her eye was really hurting at this point, and so she wanted to look one more time before she went on land to go find a doctor. Abby went into the bathroom, locked the door behind her, took a deep breath, and then faced herself in the mirror. And when she saw her eye, she could tell it was in really bad shape. She couldn't imagine how she looked to her crewmates. Abby ran her finger along her eyelid to see if maybe she could find some foreign object in her eye that was causing so much irritation. And then a moment later, as she was kind of rubbing her finger around her eye, she actually felt something that was kind of small and thin, and she managed to pull it out of her eye. And when she did, Abby immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Now that she'd found whatever foreign object was in her eye, she thought maybe she would start to feel better. But when she got a good look at this thing she had pulled from her eye, she screamed. Pinched between her fingers, writhing around, was a half-inch-long worm. Her first instinct was to throw it in the toilet. Her second was to throw up. Instead, she ran down the hall to Allison's door, barged inside, and showed her this worm she had pulled from her eye. Allison's jaw dropped. She told Abby that she'd worked on a lot of boats over the years and seen some strange things, but nothing like this. Allison asked if Abby had handled any infected-looking fish while cleaning the nets. Maybe this worm was actually some sort of maggot. But just the idea of finding fly larvae in her eye made Abby immediately sick to her stomach. And so she threw this little worm into Allison's trash can, then she sat on her bed and tried not to hyperventilate. Allison flipped open her computer and Googled salmon worms. Abby looked over her shoulder as they scanned the results. They existed, but there was no mention of them in connection with humans. Allison told Abby she really had to go see a doctor. The boat wasn't going back out to sea for 24 hours, so Abby had time. Hopefully there was some kind of medication they could give her. Abby went to the ship's galley where they kept a folder of emergency contacts and found the number of an urgent care clinic in town. Abby called, explained her situation, and then booked their next available appointment, which was early the next morning. Then Abby went back to her bunk and did her best not to totally freak out about the situation she was in. However, every time she began to doze off, something would wiggle around inside of her eye, and she'd bolt awake with her heart thumping. The next morning, Abby sat in the small clinic waiting area, tapping her feet nervously. She had arrived early after a terrible night's sleep. Her left eye was totally bloodshot and swollen, and her eyelid was drooping worse than ever. A few minutes later, the doctor called Abby into a treatment room, and right away, Abby told the doctor all about her horrifying symptoms over the past 5 days. The doctor nodded, but admitted he had not seen a case like hers before. The clinic had treated plenty of sailors and fishermen over the years who'd caught odd parasites out at sea, usually from handling old fish carcasses, but those typically affected the intestines, not the eyes. Abby was confused by this. How was it possible that she'd caught something that a local doctor in this area had never treated before? What had Abby done that was so different from the other fishermen? The doctor then had Abby lean back in a reclining chair and swiveled a bright light above her head. Abby squinted while the doctor held her left eye open and gently traced along its edge with a small tool. Then suddenly the doctor froze. Abby tensed as the doctor switched instruments, picking up a small set of tweezers, and then he leaned closer. Abby felt the doctor pluck something from her eye, and then slowly the doctor lifted it towards the light. It was another worm. This one was almost the size of a paperclip. When Abby saw it, she dug her nails into the armrests, totally repulsed. How many of these worms were in her eye? Abby moved to sit up, but the doctor held her down. They were not done. Minutes later, he'd rooted out another worm hiding beneath her eyelid. Abby's mind raced. Where had these worms come from? But even more importantly, why didn't the doctor know what they were or what they were capable of? What if some of these worms had burrowed deeper in towards her brain? Who knew what kind of damage they could cause? The doctor eventually slid his chair back, peeled off his gloves, and sighed deeply. He admitted Abby's situation seemed very serious, but he didn't have the equipment to determine what these creatures were or how to get rid of all of them. Abby's best bet was to fly home and see an eye specialist as soon as possible. Abby agreed, then she stood up, thanked the doctor, and headed back outside. She walked along the sleepy small-town streets in a blur, thinking through every worst-case scenario, from blindness to brain damage to death. She felt invaded, overwhelmed, and totally alone. Abby walked back to the dock and apologized to the captain, but she said she had to go home right now. Then she packed her things and booked the next flight to Oregon. The next afternoon, Abby landed in Portland, Oregon. She walked off the plane and took a taxi straight to the ophthalmology department of Oregon Health and Science University. Her stomach churned with worry, but it felt good to be back in her home state. Abby speed-walked into the huge modern medical complex, signed in, and then asked the nurse to please hurry. She checked her eye with her phone's camera. It was still totally blood red, very puffy, and her upper eyelid was drooping so much, Abby wondered how much longer she'd even be able to open her eye at all. Minutes later, the nurse called her name and took her back to a room where several eye specialists were waiting. Once Abby was in there, she explained each stage of what had happened to her. Her weeks on the boat, the worsening inflammation, all the worms she'd removed. They listened and nodded, while one of them jotted notes. When Abby finished, one of the doctors leaned forward and told her that he had some good news. This was likely nothing. He said that patients often come in thinking they have some sort of parasite or weird insect in their eye, but it was usually just mucus. Abby felt her blood rising. The doctor in Alaska did not pull mucus out of her eye. They were definitely worms. He had even sent them to a lab for analysis. The doctors in the room told Abby to lie back on an operating table. One of them pulled up a chair, clicked on a pen light, and shone it into her left eyeball. Abby steadied her breathing while he inspected her eye. A few minutes later, he clicked the light off and slid the chair back. There was nothing there. He suggested she must have interacted with something on the boat and then maybe touched her eye, but whatever worms she'd contracted were gone now. Abby pleaded with them to please wait a bit and try again. She'd gone to bed last night feeling worms moving around in her eye, so she knew they were still there. And so the doctors exchanged doubtful looks, but agreed to let Abby linger a bit longer since she'd come all the way from Alaska. They all got up and left Abby alone in the examining room. Abby sat there staring up at the ceiling, feeling more and more impatient. For once, she actually wanted the worms to be there. Finally, about half an hour later, she felt one squiggle under her eyelid. She shouted to the doctors who were out in the hallway. They dashed inside, peeled back her left eyelid, leaned in close, searching with the light, and then one of the doctors let out a startled shriek. Abby almost laughed. It obviously was not a good sign for experienced medical professionals to react this way, but at least they were seeing what she was seeing. The doctor removed the worm they just saw and placed it in a sterilized container for testing, and then continued examining Abby's left eye. Within minutes, they'd found another 2 worms. The doctors were buzzing. None of them had ever seen anything like this. They asked Abby loads of questions, but Abby mostly had questions of her own for them. Where had she caught these worms, and how could there be so many? Were they breeding and reproducing in her eye? How dangerous were they? And what if this was just the start of something much, much worse? But the doctors were almost as baffled as Abby, and they couldn't really answer her questions, leaving her feeling scared and frustrated. When the appointment was over, Abby left the building and sat in a patch of grass out front. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on the warmth of the sun, but she could still feel the worms moving beneath her eyelid. The following week, one of the world's leading parasite experts, Dr. Richard Bradbury, strode to the front desk of the CDC's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. The receptionist handed Dr. Bradbury a package marked urgent. Back in his office, he opened up the package and spread the contents across his desk. There was a container with worms preserved in formaldehyde, along with a case report from a pathology clinic on the other side of the country. Parasites were his specialty, so Dr. Bradbury was used to being sent worms and other weird creatures in the mail. But right away, Dr. Bradbury could tell this was an unusual case. These were worms pulled from someone's eye. Dr. Bradbury knew of only one species that fit this description, a rare parasite known as the California eyeworm. It usually only infected smaller mammals like dogs, cats, or sheep, but every once in a while, it found its way into humans. This was worrying. In smaller mammals, the worm's impact was sometimes mild, but occasionally, the worms would lead to cysts or even blindness. But in a human, the potential harm from these worms was mostly unknown. Dr. Bradbury realized Abby might be in serious danger. He also worried that the condition might be contagious. Was it possible she had spread the worms to other people? If so, he needed to act fast. Dr. Bradbury lifted his pen to fill out the case file and write down that he believed it was a California eyeworm, but he hesitated. Alaska was a long way from California, and the California eyeworm really didn't infect humans most of the time. And so the doctor had this nagging feeling that maybe something different had invaded Abby's eye. Dr. Bradbury took the worm sample and crossed the campus to the laboratory. Using a small set of tongs, he placed one of the worms between 2 small squares of glass and then slid that under a microscope. Zooming in, he immediately saw that this was not a California eyeworm. This worm's mouth and genitalia were a different shape, and other body parts were in the wrong places. The longer Dr. Bradbury studied this worm, the more certain he became that this was something he'd never actually encountered before. Which left him wondering, what was this? He was a parasite specialist with decades of experience. If he couldn't identify it, who could? Dr. Bradbury consulted the CDC's massive reference collection, which included hundreds of obscure parasites from all around the world. Thumbing through one catalog after another, none of the worms on file matched the one he'd just seen at the lab. It was time-consuming, tedious work, but Dr. Bradbury had built his career on this kind of attention to detail. Going chronologically, Dr. Bradbury dug past the 50s, the 40s, and into the 30s, sifting through every documented parasite the CDC had in its files. His eyes were starting to glaze over when suddenly he stopped. His eyes froze on an unusual scientific drawing. It was dated 1928, and the accompanying text was in German, but the image looked remarkably similar to the sample he had seen under the microscope. The worm in the drawing was absolutely the same as the one from Abby Beckley's eye. But this worm had never been found in a human before, because it was a worm found only in cattle. It was called Thalassia gullosa. These worms live an extremely strange life. They live, mate, and procreate on the surface of a cow's eye. When they produce baby worms, the cow's eye oozes pus to protect itself. Then the flies that kind of hang around the cow step in the pus and drink up some of the baby worms. The baby worms then grow inside the fly until they get too big, and the fly vomits them out, usually into the eye of a different cow. That's how the disease spreads. But in Abby's case, a fly threw up baby worms into her left eye, and they had been living and growing there ever since. The next day, Abby sat in her apartment listening as the doctor from Oregon Health and Science University explained her diagnosis. She slumped back into her couch, totally repulsed. She was relieved they'd finally solved the mystery, but this was so gross. She thought back to the single cow that was on her summer ranch. Abby had often noticed how flies were always swarming all over the cow's eyeballs, but the cow didn't seem to mind or do anything about them. Abby would never think of that lonely old cow the same way again. Abby asked the doctor what the next step was, and the doctor said they had discussed the situation and had actually decided against sending her medicine. Anti-parasitic treatments would definitely kill these worms, but a dead worm might get stuck in Abby's eye and cause permanent scarring. The safest treatment was for Abby to remove the worms herself, one by one, for as long as it took. Abby groaned. This was not the happy ending she'd been hoping for. But she did it. Every time Abby felt a squirming feeling in her eye, she went to the mirror, leaned in, and then pulled the slimy little creature out of her eye with her fingers. Over the next couple of weeks, Abby would remove 8 more worms from her eye, and at that point it seemed like there were none left. In time, Abby would make a full recovery and she would enroll in college to study psychology. However, no matter who she meets, she rarely tells them that one of her claims to fame is being only the 11th person in North American history to be infected by these eyeworms.
911 dispatchers hear a lot of interesting stories coming from the other end of the phone. But one group of dispatchers out of Reno, Nevada may win the award for the creepiest 911 calls ever received. When the details of these calls they got were put online, the internet went crazy. Here is their story. There was this old couple that lived about 20 miles east of Reno, Nevada. In 2010, the husband dies, leaving the wife all alone in this house. Shortly after his passing, she began calling 911 2-3 times a week, requesting things like, can you please put some water on to boil? Hey, can you change the thermostat? It was clear she was showing signs of dementia, and the dispatchers were respectful of her and gently told her that this is 911, you can only call if it's an emergency, and at some point the woman would understand her mistake and she would say sorry and she would hang up. No first responders were ever sent out for these calls because it didn't seem like an emergency, it just seemed like a confused elderly person. But no matter how many times they told her, she kept calling back. And eventually her calls took a turn. Instead of calling 911 to ask for help with mundane tasks around the house, she would call 911 believing she was talking directly to her deceased husband, John. The dispatcher would pick up and the woman would say, John, where are you? John, John. By this time, the dispatchers had gotten so many calls from this woman, they would recognize her address coming through and they knew what to expect. They would answer the phone, they'd be respectful, and they would tell her like they always did, this is 911, you can't call here, you need to talk to your family. And again, they did not send a responding unit out to her because it just seemed like she was confused, not in any danger. But one day when she called, she sounded frantic and scared. John, please come home, help me, I need help. John, come home. This time they would send first responders out to the woman's house. When the responding unit arrives at her house just minutes after she had placed the 911 call, they go to the door and they're knocking and they're yelling for her and she's not coming to the door and it's all quiet in the house. The door's unlocked, so they open it up and they announce themselves. They walk inside and immediately they can tell the heat is not on because it's very, very cold inside the house. They look around the first floor and they can't find her and there's no sign of a struggle or any obvious problems that could have happened inside of the house. So they go upstairs and they start searching all the rooms and no one's there until they get to the last room and it's the bedroom. They go inside and there's an older woman who's lying on the bed and she's clearly deceased and has been for several hours because rigor mortis had already set in. The police are able to confirm that the woman who's lying on the bed is the same woman who owns the house and lives there. And at this point, they call back to dispatch and they tell them, hey, the woman that you claim made this 911 call, well, it can't have been her. Because based on rigor mortis, she was dead at the time that 911 call was made. But the dispatchers are like, no way. We know what she sounds like. We speak to her multiple times a week. We have a whole protocol built when we see her address come across because we speak to her so often. That 911 call that you got that led you to that house where she was, that call was made by her. What they ultimately decide is the reason for this discrepancy is she didn't have rigor mortis. She was just stiff because it was really cold inside of her house, and that she had died in those couple of minutes between leaving the 911 call and when officers arrived. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're a little freaked out. A few days go by and another call is placed to 911 coming from that woman's home address. The dispatcher sees that and has to do a double take, like that's not possible. But they're thinking, okay, this could be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be anything. Picks up the phone and she's shocked when it's the same woman who is frantically yelling for John to come here, save me, help me, I need help. And the dispatcher, who's well aware of the history and well aware that this woman's supposed to be dead, stays calm, goes through the procedure, tries to get more information from this woman, but the call ends abruptly and there's no more information to be had. And so not knowing what else to do, she asks a responding unit to go check this house out. The responding unit goes over to the property, they knock on the door, no one's inside, the door is actually still open, they go in, the house is empty, there's no one there, there's no one that could have made that call. At this point, dispatch is like, okay, this has got to be a prank. But the next day, same thing happens. Here comes a call from the dead woman's house. They pick it up and it's this distraught woman yelling for help. I need my husband. And the dispatcher is trying to get more information, but they can't. And then the line cuts out. Once again, they have to send responders to this location because this woman has called 911 and is saying that she needs help. And once again, the officers get to the house and it's vacant. Just like when she was alive, these calls would persist multiple times a week. They continued even after her house was broken into and burned to the ground. There's not even a house anymore. And there are still calls coming through from that address to 911. Finally, the police get in touch with the phone company and they explain the situation, and the phone company looks at their records and they say, actually, her phone line was disconnected almost immediately after she was deceased. But they tell police there's a chance that it might not have been disconnected properly at the site, and that could be a reason why it's still working. So they send a lineman to go check out the actual property to confirm her lines were disconnected properly and that no wires were getting crossed, and he said all of it checked out. Everything has been detached this whole time. The phone company thought perhaps there was a digital recording of her that got trapped in their system and was randomly bouncing to their call center. But the dispatchers would say, it doesn't sound like a recording that's playing the same every single time. It's always the same message. She's yelling for her husband to come save her. But the way she sounds is always different. It's a unique phone call every single time. So because there wasn't a definitive explanation for why this was happening, they had to treat each call like it was serious. And so multiple times a week for a year, they received these ghost calls and had to send out responding officers to check on her, even though the house was gone and there was nothing there and there was never anyone there. It was just a vacant lot. And then finally, a year after this woman has died, the calls just abruptly stopped. And the police did not launch an investigation into what it was, because the reality is police need to prioritize things that are threats to people or places. And this really wasn't either of those things. It was just really bizarre. And so the official explanation for how a dead woman could be calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent house for a year is, we don't know. In 2015, 32-year-old Henry McCabe was living just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, with his wife, Corrine, and their 2 daughters. Henry was a Liberian immigrant who worked as an auditor for the Minnesota Department of Revenue. On September 6th, Henry's wife and his 2 kids head out to California to visit with some family, leaving Henry alone. Henry decides, you know what, I don't get a chance to go out very much because I'm working all the time, I got family, and so tonight I'm going to cut loose. So he calls his 2 very close friends and they decide to go to a nightclub. They get to to the nightclub, and Henry very quickly starts drinking a lot of alcohol, and lots of people that were at the club would say he seemed pretty intoxicated. The trio would stay at the nightclub till about 2 in the morning, and then when they left, Henry, who had driven there and met his two friends at the club, was about to drive himself home when one of his two friends said, "Wait a minute, you can't be driving. We'll give you a ride home." So Henry gets in the car with them and they start driving to Henry's house. But when they're about halfway there, Henry tells them to go to a very specific gas station. He said he wanted to get food and a drink, but the gas station he was trying to go to was 2 miles in the opposite direction away from his house. And his friends are telling him, we can bring you to a closer gas station. We can bring you somewhere that's more convenient. But Henry was really aggressive and very adamant that that was the gas station he wanted to go to. And in fact, "I don't even want you to wait for me. I want you to drop me off. I will get whatever I want and then I'll walk home." And his friends put up a bit of a fight, but ultimately they relented and they drove him to this gas station. They dropped him off, they watched him go inside, and they turned around and they left. At 2:28 in the morning, Henry's wife, Corinne, looked at her phone and she saw she had a missed call and a voicemail from Henry. She opens it up and she listens to it and she's horrified at what she hears. On the voicemail, Henry sounds incredibly distressed. He's yelling that he's been shot and it sounds like he's in pain. And then in the background, you hear this really intense growling sound. It's pretty easy to distinguish. And then Henry starts screaming about whatever is growling at him. And then Henry yells out, "Stop it," before the phone cuts out. The full 2-minute voicemail has never been released by police. This is what was made publicly available. Right after Corinne listens to this voicemail, she tries calling Henry, and it goes straight to voicemail. So she tries calling Henry's brother. She can't get in touch with him, so she calls the police. So the police go out looking for Henry. They go to his house. He's not there. And then they track down the two friends he was with, who immediately tell them, "Hey, we dropped him off at this gas station. We know it's a little bit strange that he wanted to go here, but he was insistent, and so that's where we dropped him off." So the police look around the gas station. They talk to the attendant. They talk to some people that were there, and no one knows where Henry is. So at this point, the police pull Henry's phone records, and they can see he placed a call to his wife at about 2:23 in the morning, but they can't determine where he was when he placed this call. The assumption is he was at the gas station. Then just a few minutes later, he places another call to his brother, and his brother would report to police that all Henry was doing on the call was just sobbing. And again, with that phone call, the police were not able to pinpoint where Henry was when he made the call. And following that call to his brother, he turned his phone off. Several hours later, his phone would turn back on and it would ping about 4 miles away from this gas station, and then his phone would turn off again. And the police are thinking, you know what, it's a grown man. He went out drinking with his friends. He's bound to sober up and turn up at some point. Let's just wait this one out. But Henry didn't turn up. And days turned into weeks, turned into months, and no one's heard from Henry. No one has any idea where he is. On November 2nd, so 2 months after Henry goes missing, his body is found in a lake up near the area where his cell phone had last pinged. This area is a very difficult area to access. There's no public access to this lake, and the lake sits in a very heavily forested area. Even though Henry had told his wife on the voicemail that he had been shot, and it sounds like he's being attacked on the voicemail, there were no injuries to his body. And so even though the case was bizarre to everybody involved, they ruled it an accidental drowning. Some say he took his own life because he had recently bounced a check for his rent and he had a bad performance review at work. Others say he was just intoxicated and stumbled into the lake and drowned. But neither of those explanations account for the very obvious growling and strange sounds that we heard on his voicemail. And so to this day, Henry McCabe's death remains a mystery. The following stories all take place in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. On New Year's Eve 1980, 20-year-old Karen Potak was out at a bar with her friends celebrating, and at some point in the night, she slipped out because she didn't want to stay any later, and she began walking home. Now, she didn't have a jacket on, and it was very cold outside, and she's kind of stumbling through the streets, and a man sees her and pulls over and offers to give her a ride home. She's kind of intoxicated, and so she agrees to get in his car, and they drive off. A couple hours later, around 3 a.m., the police receive this phone call.
Yes, please, this this is an emergency. Please send a squad car to Pierce Butler Road, Malmberg Manufacturing Company Machine Shop. Please send an ambulance too. There's a girl hurt there.
Can you tell me what happened to her?
Just hurry. She's laying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks by the engine room. Hurry.
What's the address?
I don't know.
Who are you?
Using this information from the caller, the police arrive in the back of that building and they find Karen Potak. She had been repeatedly bludgeoned over the head with a tire iron and then left for dead. Miraculously, she would survive, but because of her head injury, she forgot almost everything about that night, including the description of the guy who picked her up and who probably attacked her and who probably was the one who called police. So the police tried to interview some people in the area around where she was found, but it was a really deserted area and no one knew anything, and there was no physical evidence left at the scene, so the case went cold. Then, 5 months later, the police receive another phone call.
Oh, you find me? I just stabbed somebody with a knife stick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody. Hello? Are you there?
At this point, the police were not connecting this call with the call that immediately preceded finding Karen Potak, meaning they did not think that was the same person. And since in this call there were no instructions on where to find this person, they didn't really have anything to go on, so they took note of it, but ultimately kind of disregarded it. But just a few hours later, a group of teenagers were walking through the forest when they found a dead body. The body belonged to 18-year-old Kimberly Compton, who had literally just moved to Minnesota. She graduated high school and decided she wanted to start fresh in Minnesota. She hopped on a bus, she goes to Minnesota, she gets off the bus, she goes into the first restaurant she sees, which is a diner. She sits down by herself, she's eating some food, and a man approaches her and says, "Hey, can I sit down with you?" And so she lets him sit down and he asks, who are you? What are you doing here? And she says, "Oh, I just moved here." And this guy offers to drive her around town and show her the sights. And she's like, "Great." 15 minutes later, he would kill her with an ice pick. At this point, police are beginning to suspect that this person who keeps calling them immediately before they're finding women that have been attacked might be the same person. And 2 days after Compton was killed, they get another call that confirms this.
Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had to stab her. I'm so upset about it. I keep getting drunk every night. I can't believe I did it. It's like a big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else.
From this point forward, they referred to this caller as the weepy-voiced killer. And even though they had his voice recorded, they didn't have any physical evidence because he didn't leave any at the scene with Compton either, so they didn't have much to go on. The police would go to the diner and they would talk to the staff that was there and they would give a general description of the weepy-voiced killer, but it wasn't enough to pinpoint a suspect. So once again, this case went cold too. 6 months later, the police received yet another call.
Please don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one over in St. Paul. I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm sick. I think I'm going to kill myself, I think.
Where are you?
I'm just going to. If somebody dies with a red shirt on, it's me. I've killed more people. I'll never make it to heaven.
Calm down.
A day later, they find the body of 40-year-old Barbara Simons floating in the Mississippi River, tucked up against some brush. The night before, Barbara had been out at a bar and she had offered a cigarette to a man she hadn't met before. They began flirting and kind of hit it off, and at one point they were going to leave together, and before they left, Barbara turns to one of the waitresses and kind of jokingly says, "Boy, I hope he's nice because I'm leaving with him." And the waitress, for whatever reason, had a really bad feeling about it and made a point of getting a really good look at the man she was leaving with. And that man, of course, would turn out to be the weepy-voiced killer, and as soon as he and Barbara left the bar, he would stab her to death and throw her in the Mississippi River. After the police began investigating this, they came to the bar and they interviewed that waitress. And she said, "I got a really good look at this guy." And so the police show her 100 different mugshots of previously convicted felons in the area. And she immediately identifies 38-year-old Paul Stefani and says, "That's the guy." Paul had been convicted for aggravated assault, and he also had a history of mental illness. Paul is immediately put under surveillance, but within 24 hours, he manages to ditch his tail and goes straight into downtown Minneapolis, where he picks up 19-year-old street worker Denise Williams. Paul took her down a dark alleyway and she kind of sensed something was wrong. And so she grabbed a glass bottle that was sitting on the floor of the car. And when he went to attack her, she managed to hit him in the head and cut his face really, really badly. And she managed to protect herself enough that she could get out of the car and run away and save her own life. And a neighbor saw her running out of the car and kind of saw the whole exchange, didn't like how it looked, so they called 911. When police showed up, Paul was long gone. That same night, police get another call from the weepy voice killer. This one's a little bit different. He's actually asking for help for himself.
I need an ambulance.
Where?
1505 Westminster.
1505
Yes,
Westminster. What's the problem?
I'm all cut up. I got beat up.
What's your apartment number?
208, I'm bleeding.
208. Where are you bleeding from?
From my arm, my face, my head.
Now, by the time this call is being made, the audio recordings of his previous phone calls had been made public. They were aired on radio shows, on TV. People had heard his voice, and it's fairly distinctive. And the dispatcher recognized his voice and told police, there's a chance the weepy voice killer just called us. So an ambulance comes and picks up Paul Stefani and brings him to the hospital, and when he's sitting in his hospital bed, police walk in and they apprehend him. He pled not guilty, and prosecutors did not actually have that much evidence connecting him to each of these attacks. They had these audio recordings, but that was about it. And so ultimately he got 58 years in prison, not a life sentence. But considering his age, it wound up functioning like a life sentence. 12 years into that sentence, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and was told he only had a year to live. And so it was at this point that he confessed to all of the attacks, including one they didn't know about. He murdered 33-year-old Kathleen Greening in her own home. He just didn't make a phone call to police afterwards. Paul would die shortly after his confession. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to your birthday party, but then give them the wrong address. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.